your books, I think it might have been the Buddha's brain. You say that what flows through your mind sculpts your brain.
Yes.
I think it's really beautiful. So can we start there by having a definition for what the mind is and how it's different to the brain?
Sure. Well, at a basic level, we are all having experiences. You are seeing me, I am seeing you. We are having thoughts, we are having feelings. Those experiences are certainly our mind, right? And our experiences are not physical. You cannot touch them. But then also, we have a body, we have a brain. So, in effect, the way scientists, neuroscientists think about this is that the nervous system processes information, much like a computer processes information. The hardware is distinct from the software. So, in that sense, they're distinct. The broad definition of mind is all the information represented by a nervous system, some fraction of which is the basis of our conscious experiences. Where it gets really interesting is when you realize that all mental activity, all of our thoughts, all of our desires, our hopes and our sorrows, all of that requires underlying neural activity. They co-occur, right? They co-occur. And because mental activity enlists neural activity to represent it, the mind has a causal force of its own. The mind matters in its own right. It doesn't just reduce to the meat. And this means that since repeated patterns of mental activity involve repeated patterns of neural activity, repeated patterns of neural activity leave lasting physical traces behind as durable changes of neural structure and function. This means that we have the power, every one of us has the power, to use our minds to change our brains, to change our minds for the better, to help ourselves and everyone else on the planet.
Oh, that's beautiful. Um, that brings me to really nicely into the notion of suffering. Since we
Mm,
have a choice of how we use our brain and our minds
yeah.
to try to foster greater joy, let's talk about what's at the real root of suffering.
Well, it's very deep. So I'm really appreciate you starting there because in part, some of what I might talk about could be misunderstood as just positive thinking, and it's not that at all. We must begin with suffering. Uh, I think there are two kinds of suffering. There is inevitable, inescapable suffering, the physical discomfort of a brick falling on your foot or illness. Then there's inherent emotional suffering when you care about people who are being mistreated and it wounds your heart. Or someone is mean to you. Of course, you're going to react to that. That's the first kind. But then there's the second kind of suffering that we add to inevitable, inescapable suffering of life. We add our reactions to what's happening. And also, often things are basically fine, but we get all messed up in our head about it, all driven or neurotic or anti, blah. I speak from some personal experience here, right? This is the second kind, which is arguably the bulk of our suffering. And on the one hand, because it's what we create ourselves, because of our habits, our reactions. Understandably, I'm a longtime therapist. We acquire tendencies in our childhood. Maybe we've been traumatized. We bring that to bear. But it's poignant that we add it. And it also is hopeful because it means that if we are the cause of it, we can be the cause of its end. And so there's some major aspects of the suffering we create ourselves. Maybe we'll talk about. I'll just say a particular quick thing, which is one of the things that can help us suffer less is to grow psychological resources inside ourselves, like grit or gratitude or compassion or self worth. Also, obviously, if we can improve the world, we will suffer less. Many
Mm.
people suffer unnecessarily because of poverty, racism, injustice of all kinds, sexism, every kind of stuff. And so it's important both to take action out in the world, as well as action in our physical bodies to have good food, have good water, and so forth, and also inside our mind. I focus on the mind. I'm a psychologist, and also because I think the mind is full of opportunity, and you take the benefits wherever you go, no matter what setting you're in. But meanwhile, yes, let's do what we can to help the world become a better place for everybody.
So you know what I love about that? I think, and particularly what I love about your work, while we might strive to improve the world or the environment that we live in, I think there are limitations to that, right?
Yeah,
You can't control how the person in the room is going to act or respond.
that's right.
You can't control the events that happen to you in life.
Yeah.
And I think where you have the greatest control is in the skill set that you develop within your mind, which is why I really love your work. Like, so just before we started this interview,
So beautifully said. You are completely right and beautifully said.
we talked a little bit before we started the interview about your own interview with Professor Stephen Progress. And what I really took away from that was
Mhm.
that resilience was about looking at the response, the physiological response we had to stress that really moved us away from our equilibrium, but
Okay.
then finding those tools to regain it. Did I get that?
Yes.
Yes. High five.
High five. Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about that because I think what I first want us to discuss is the physiological response that we have to stress because a lot of us
Mm.
we without an understanding of what's happening within our brains and within our bodies, it's
Yeah.
easy to put the way we feel onto external circumstances. If you
Mm.
would behave differently, I would feel better. So
Yeah.
let's talk a bit about what's happening within us.
Well, let's see. This is great. So, first, the good news is that our equilibrium, which is a fancy way of saying our home base, all right? You know, that feeling of coming home, right? You're a little kid, you crawl into your mommy's lap, that's home base. You know, you get home, you're an adult, long day of work, you know, people are crazy. Close the front door,
Ah,
put the kettle on, cup of tea, home base. All right. Our natural home base, psychologically, is well being. When we, as human animals, like other complex animals, feel that their needs are met enough, you're safe enough, you're satisfied enough, and you're connected enough. It'd be nice to have more, but there's an enoughness to it. We calm down, we conserve our resources, we repair and we refuel ourselves. That's our home base, and in that home base, the body is calm, and there's a sense of well-being, and the mind is colored with a general sense of peacefulness, contentment, and love. That's good news. That's our deep nature. On the other hand, to survive and to cope, we are able to leave that home base. We're disturbed from it for brief, ideally for brief adaptive periods of coping. There's a line that all episodes of stress in the wild end quickly, one way or another. And then, however it ends, equilibrium is restored. Okay, so that's the framework. And that's really good news. It means we just need to come home. We just need to reduce our disturbances to settle into who we naturally really are. Okay, what Dr. Porges has pointed out, and other people like him, is that the body is very involved in these states of disturbance based on stress, in which we're jostled out of our resting state. And the problem is, unlike episodes of stress in the wild and ending quickly, humans are exposed to chronic stress, chronic sense of distraction, disturbance, drivenness, multitasking, pressure, isolation, mistreatment, emotional upset, rumination, blah, 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 blah. So, what Dr. Porges, to summarize, points out is that, in effect, we can intervene. The body mind connection gives us two places where we can make things better. We can intervene in the mind. We can deliberately think about things that help us be calmer and feel more connected. Like if another person mistreats us, we can do things inside our mind like remind ourselves that we're a good person, bring up the feeling of allies inside ourselves who love us and care about us, remind ourselves that that other person is a jerk and it's not about me. You know, we can do those things inside our mind. Also, in our body, though, we can help our bodies directly. We can take some big breaths. We can deliberately um, put ourselves in situations that feel comforting and soothing, like putting water on our face, or eating a little bit of something that tastes good, or looking out a window and seeing something beautiful, you know, calming ourselves down. So that's fantastic, isn't it? That we can help ourselves in both kinds of ways.
It's so beautiful because so when you were talking about all the stressors, it took me back to the original point about talking about the mind and the brain. And it
Yeah,
felt like all of these were just compounding where we were developing a brain that was more
yeah,
attuned to stress
yeah,
because we're so exposed to stress. And sometimes it's hard to mentally shift out of that stressful position. But
yeah,
now what you're saying is that if you can't get there with your mind, like if you
yeah,
can't think yourself into a peaceful, happy place. You
right.
can use your body to help you get there.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll tell you a really neat thing I've been doing lately. It's a three breath meditation. Now, the reason for it, it relates to my latest book with a
Yeah.
cover that I really love this cover because I'm a mountain climbing guy. I'm a rock climber, and I just love the idea of going up to the top and, all that good stuff. So there's science in the book, and people can check it out and all the rest of that. But here, let's do it together for fun. And people watching can do this. Three breaths. Three breaths. Okay, ready?
Yep.
And it might take a little more than three breaths to do it because
Right.
I'll explain it a little bit. And think of it as like an experiment inside yourself. You're a scientist inside your own mind doing an experiment. Okay, here we go. First breath, breathing while feeling your chest as a whole. Okay. In the second breath, breathing while feeling caring. Maybe aware of the area around your heart, maybe with a hand on your heart. Just keeping it simple, the feeling of being with people you like or appreciate or even love. Breathing while feeling caring. Good. And then in the third breath, breathing while feeling cared about. This could be a little more challenging, keeping it simple. What's it like to be with people who appreciate you, like you, maybe love you? They're friendly toward you. Breathing while feeling cared about. Okay. Now we could take longer. I can see in your face already. I can feel it in my own self. Woof. Just that, less than half a minute. And neurologically, there's, because we understand now more and more about the body, we can deliberately create practices like that which I just created there to that are based on our understanding of the body. For example, really briefly, when you pay attention to your body sensations, that immediately turns down the volume on the voice inside the head, right? The voice in the back of the head, which is the major source of rumination and stress,
Mm.
right? Just paying attention to body sensations. Second, internal sensations of the chest, right? When you tune into your internal sensations rather than external sensations, you use a part of the brain called the insula. And when you use the insula through tuning into your internal sensations, that acts like a circuit breaker in another part of the brain that's the basis for the default mode network, which is a fancy way of talking about, I call it the ruminator. The part of the brain that, obsessing about the future, the past, rehashing conversations. Why, oh, why does no one love me? Why, oh, why are they jerks? Da, 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 da. The ruminator. So as soon as you go internal to the body sensations, boom, the ruminator gets quiet. Also, when you tune into your anything as a whole, your chest as a whole, or if you like, the room as a whole, anything as a whole, what that does is it deactivates parts of the brain in the midline of the cortex that are caught up in mental time travel, thinking about the future and thinking about the past, and caught up in the sense of me, myself, and I, a strong sense of selfing, which is useful sometimes, but a lot of the time creates a lot of unnecessary stress and suffering. So right there, when you go into the sense of your chest as a whole, that activates networks on the right side of your brain, calms down these networks, which brings you into the present moment with less of a burdensome sense of self-preoccupation. Right there. Those, those are neural circuits. There's research that supports what I just said. That's just the first breath. And then in the second and third breath, when you tap into feeling caring, two good things happen. One involving oxytocin. So when you start feeling more caring or cared about, there's more oxytocin activity inside your brain, which calms down anxiety through its activity both in the prefrontal cortex and the ways in which the amygdala, the alarm bell of the brain, and there are two of them, one on either side, the alarm bell of the brain has receptors for oxytocin that are inhibitory. They're like the brakes on a bicycle or a car. Those activity at those receptor sites in the amygdala, they're like little docking stations where container vessels with oxytocin molecules come in, right? And when those receptors are active, ooh, it calms down the alarm bell. Great. Also, through Steve Porges' work, the vagus nerve complex has two major branches. One goes down, it's the old one. One goes up, it's the new one. The new one is involved in relationship experiences. The old one really calms the internal organs of the body. This means that since these two branches are connected, activity in one ripples into the other. So, by focusing on heartfelt experiences of caring flowing in and caring flowing out, we activate the more recent second branch of the vagus nerve complex, and then activity in it ripples on down into the original branch, which calms us, calms, slows the heart rate, gives us a sense of ease and coming together in ourselves. So I gave you like five or six separate neural hardware circuitry that's involved in that half a minute practice of just three breaths.